Welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics or are your politics starting to shape your faith. In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orlin Johnson. Let me introduce you to our panelists that we have here for today. First, we have Ms. Carmela Monk Crawford, who's the editor of Message Magazine. We have Melissa Reed, who is the Government Affairs Director for the North American Division of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We have Ms. Bettina Krause, who is the editor of Liberty Magazine. And we have Ms. Jennifer Woods, who's the General Counsel and Director of Public Affairs and Religious Liberty for the Lake Union Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Ladies, it's great having you guys with us today and looking forward to our conversation. You know, in our first segment, I'm starting to see some real interesting legislation that's taking place. In Arizona, most recently, they basically are considering a new bill, which is nearly identical to a bill they tried to pass in 2021. But what they wanted to do was actually create what I would call an alarming way of the definition of things like discriminatory act and making it even broader. This legislation was kind of put in place to deal with COVID and things of that nature, but it also wanted to forbid the government from imposing any fees, penalties, damages against a religious organization or religious corporation in connection with the organization exercise of their religion. On one hand, we kind of understand this. It makes sense that you want to make sure that you're protecting religious organizations. But on the other hand, the definition of religious organizations and religious corporations seem to be expanding in a way that it doesn't make any sense. Some people are starting to call this religious exemption on steroids. You know, Bettina, when you see some of these things that we have a number of states that are putting in place, on one hand, it looks like it's benign that you are actually changing definitions, but on the other hand, it could create some problems down the road because it almost looks like we are creating some new categories for blanket immunity, some new categories for criminal liability, and at the end of the day, this may end up hurting organizations that are religious more than helping them. Do I have that right? Tell me something what's going on with this.
So, Orlin, I think we need to put these bills in context, not just the one in Arizona, but bills that have been introduced and passed in many other conservative states as well. And they were, as you say, designed primarily to protect houses of worship during public emergencies. But here's the thing. These pieces of legislation are largely performative. They are messaging bills. They provide a robust solution to an imaginary problem. And so they're feeding into culture war narratives because, yes, we saw a slew of appeals for emergency injunctions come up through the circuits to the Supreme Court during COVID. But we also saw the court thoughtfully applying the First Amendment and those protections to provide meaningful religious liberty protection for houses of worship. So these pieces of legislation are largely unnecessary. But on the other hand, I also think that many of the claims that are being made on the side of the aisle, that churches are now going to start trying to avoid fire code regulations, for instance. I think they are also largely a parade of imaginary horribles because, you know, if these issues start to be litigated, there is going to be pressure applied to narrow these exemptions in meaningful and common sense ways.
Yeah, well, I absolutely agree with Bettina's analysis that this is unfortunately mostly or primarily just sort of a messaging bill for a particular party or, you know, a more right-wing party. I think that said, I think that there is reasons to have discussions about making sure that churches or religious services are not treated differently than other essential services. And I do consider the work of the church to be essential. And so I think as long as we're consistent in applying those standards, I think that we do well. And Bettina mentioned the Supreme Court case or the Supreme Court's rulings in this space. And like she said, this piece of state legislation goes far beyond what the Supreme Court has ruled, which is to, you know, in regards to protecting worship services during times of crisis. And what the Supreme Court has made clear is that the government may not impose emergency restrictions on houses of worship that are more severe, or restrictions that are imposed that are on comparable secular gatherings. And I think that that's the sweet spot that we want to hit. Again, we've seen various restrictions or ordinances in place during COVID that were just sort of all over the map as far as what was deemed as essential, what was deemed as non-essential. And I think, again, treating houses of worship impartially, consistent with the community standards is where we want to end up.
You know what, Jennifer, does it benefit someone like you? You're out there fighting on the front lines for religious freedom for a lot of members of multiple different churches in many instances. If they expand the definition of what a religious organization is, it seems like it would allow you to be able to kind of get your arms more around more things. But is that really a benefit, or does that end up creating even more of a problem for you?
Yeah, I think that you're hitting it exactly. I think it can create more of a problem. We don't want it to look as if this, religion's being favored, right? And as we start to expand this definition to include more and more organizations that count as religious organizations and that should be given this protection, I think that we might have legal protection, but is it really furthering the cause of proclaiming faith, of people actually being able to live out their faith? Is it actually going to help religion in the long run? And I don't think that it actually will.
Carmela, that seems to be the real question. Are we getting a point where we're going to get religion almost watered down because so many people are pulling it into places maybe it wasn't intended to be in? What are your thoughts on that? Because it seems like this could end up in some ways kind of pushing back, and you get a real backlash from this. I mean, maybe I'm missing something here.
I don't think you're missing anything, or let's just say both of us may be missing something, because what I see with this right now is not only a watered down of religion. I anticipate a pushback, and we have to really take it on the chin as church folks. Some of us are equating so many of these restrictions with faith, and so now we're allowing by this this legislation, we are sort of fueling the fire when we talk about sincerely held religious beliefs. And we do have to continue to go back to the context for why this bill was ushered in the first place, as Bettina has said, right? So now we can't escape the fact that there are church people out here who are equating that COVID-19 restrictions are somehow prophetic. There are church people out here who want to expand what government means in terms of prohibiting certain things. There are church people out here who want to expand what recourse is available. And this is a problem. Church folks who are demonizing public health officials. And so you have in back of this bill one guy, or at least one guy cited in the notes, that's saying it's okay to be there during church. But then you've got the science with respect to COVID-19, where if you're close proximity, you got singing and preaching with droplets going into the air, you're there for a prolonged time period, and it's a lot of people in a very small defined space sometimes. All of these things check the boxes for the science, which is why it is so important for some of our church folk to say, well, the science has to be refuted. This is a big mess, and you're right to sound the alarm. This is grave. We're going down the wrong path. Yes.
Orlin, I was going to say, you started off talking about this broad definition of discriminatory action, and that's where my real concern is. Again, it can be interpreted well beyond the confines of, a public health crisis. And in fact, the legislation says any direct or indirect act or practice that adversely affects a religious organization. And as Jennifer pointed out, unfortunately, there are religious organizations or individuals that will take advantage and misuse that sort of broad language. That sort of broad language would mean that no criminal or civil liability when there's no criminal or civil liability when a religious organization claims to be engaged in the exercise of religion. And again, I think that the Supreme Court got this right as far as trying to find that balance. I do feel like there does need to be a balance, but this broad definition is just inviting chaos and misuse.
Well, you know, what's even a little bit more troubling is we're starting to see now more definitions as it relates to what a religious organization is. There's some statutes that are now saying that a religious organization at the end of the list can be almost any corporation or any organization or any entity. I mean, Bettina, I love the ability to be able to protect people out there from a church perspective, but do I like the idea of any entity can put the stamp of being a religious organization and get similar protections? I mean, you know, I'm a little uncomfortable with that.
So you are putting your thumb on what I think is the nub of this whole thing that we're discussing now. And that is that there is a public narrative that is growing, that is building in society, that religions and religious freedom is somehow being privileged. And there was an article that was published last month in the Harvard Law Review, a note, and it was entitled "The Pandora's Box of Religious Exemptions."
Wow.
And really, it was going into some of these cases, some of this legislation, and making the point that, you know, how can a society sustain these type of broad exemptions for religious entities and in a way that sort of maintains order in society. And this is really building on this narrative that's being pushed from many different perspectives, that religion feels that the jurisprudential thumb should always be on the scale in favor of the religious interest. And I think that undermines us ultimately, because we want to protect religious freedom. It is a vital human right that we must defend, but we undermine ourselves when we start to claim too much. And I think a little bit of self-restraint is in order.
Carmela, you look like this is a troubling subject for you. I mean, what do you think about this whole expanding of the definition?
Which definition that you're talking about? We've always grown up basic civics. Government shall make no law respecting religion, and so now we have an expansion of who the government is. It could be an individual that's saying, "Hey, there's something wrong with what's going on here. Somebody is being harmed, and now this person is being held accountable for what is being." What is being limited or restricted. We have an expansion in the exemption, so that anyone could conceivably say, "I did this, and this falls under my belief." Now, the tricky part for me, and this has always been something that we have suspected, is that you have many people who held sincere beliefs that Black people were not part of God's plan. They were part of God's plan to be in an inferior position. Now we're seeing these kinds of things. The door is cracked open so that anybody can do anything and claim immunity because of this being a quote unquote sincerely held religious belief. Every right that we have has a limitation to it. Basic civics. And I think we're forgetting our basic civics lessons.
Well, I'm going to have to let that be the last word, but it looks like this is pieces of legislation that are moving around all over the United States, and we've got to keep an eye on it because we may end up creating more problems than we thought we'd have, even by people thinking they're giving us more protection. You know, and following up with some of the conversations we've had before, there was an interesting case in New York, which was called Agudath Israel of America, and they found itself actually in court against the then governor of the time, Andrew Cuomo. And what ended up happening is that this was a synagogue that had been around since 1922. And there were several other affiliated synagogues where when COVID-19 came into play, because it was so kind of hodgepodge, you literally had government at a state level coming in and actually signing to be specific that certain synagogues shouldn't be open, that certain temples shouldn't be open, that certain churches shouldn't be open in different parts of the city, and then even getting more specific that they weren't sure that depending on what type of church you were, maybe quote unquote only 10 could be there, 25 or whatever the case may be. But it turns out that the circuit court in New York, which is called the Second Circuit, ended up in a 2-1 decision and actually struck down these restrictions. But it turns out that this may have been what happened in New York, but we're seeing a lot more of this activity going on, where on one hand, we're supposed to be the United States of America, but we're starting to see so many rules and regulations that sound that we are still the Confederate States of America. And how do we keep that all in one place? Or maybe that's not the case. But, you know, Jennifer, when you look at a case like this and you start seeing that you're so specific, is it 10, is it 25, is it 50? And it sounds like people are just literally pulling it out of their hat. You know, no real rhyme or reason. And then you juxtapose that to grocery stores, stay open. You know, liquor stores, no problem. I mean, how do we fight this fight, or am I missing something here?
No, I don't think you're missing anything. What I found very troubling about this is just how arbitrary this all seemed, right? These zoning and locking down certain zones and areas that, you know, in this case, were predominantly Jewish parts of the city, where schools and restaurants and bars and other establishments were still being allowed open without really any analysis or basis for that decision is what's troubling. The Constitution's very clear, you know, that religion, people should not be prohibited from freely exercising their religion. And in this case, it was very clear that there was targeting going on. And while in the previous segment, we talked about the danger of favoring religion, I think here we're seeing the danger of religions being targeted. And this is why we need a balance. And when we leave things up to, you know, 50 or 51 different jurisdictions deciding how they're going to handle a matter like what should be closed down, what the limits are, we're going to end up with 51 different analysis and laws regarding what's essential, what's not, what the proper amount is. And so in one place, you might be able to stay open, and in next door jurisdiction, you might be shut down. And that inconsistency is problematic.
Well, and I think the distinction that Jennifer is talking about here is so important to remember, all right? So we're talking about a response to COVID-19, as we, you know, talked about in the previous segment, a response to COVID-19 that protects and comes, you know, around religious organizations. But this response to COVID-19, it was a neutral response. Here, we're looking at the science, we're defining what are risks, and we're seeking to protect people from those risks. As Jennifer has already said, the analysis was in place there, and you have religious organizations reacting to that analysis in a negative way, trying to, and in my opinion, grossly overcompensating. In this specific instance, you have the governor. Thank you, Andrew Cuomo, for the gift that keeps on giving, a nice recorded line phone call where you admit that you didn't know what you were doing and you didn't have the proper evidence to put in place for the measures that you took. So he admitted that he took a hatchet to this and closed down closed down the ability for this community to observe their religious services just before these Jewish holidays. He admitted that he didn't, this is driven by fear, not by science and not by data. And so you can't come down on religion like that just because you want to arbitrarily. This is why we have the constitutional protections.
You know, I absolutely agree. And I'm so glad to see that the courts have ended up where they have as far as striking down these restrictions. As both the two previous panelists have mentioned, targeting a specific religious group or institutions for reasons of public opinion rather than public health and safety is terrifying, in my opinion, and completely inappropriate. And again, was so glad to see that these lockdown zones restricted to the Orthodox Jewish communities that were targeted more harshly than communities with equivalent or higher rates of COVID. There was no science to back, and as Jennifer said, it was inconsistent with the other businesses, educational systems that were in that same community had different standards. Certainly not neutrally applicable, as we mentioned that that standard in the previous segment. And so was very pleased to see that the court system said, no, Governor Cuomo, this will not stand.
But Bettina, when
Yeah,
you're in such a diverse community like New York, and one size does not fit all, isn't there a way that this could have made sense to some degree?
well, I mean, Chief Justice Roberts, in one of the appeals for injunctive relief that came up to the Supreme Court, not this one, I think it was the Newsom one from the Ninth Circuit. I mean, he put it so well, and he said, the court cannot substitute itself for the judgment of publicly elected officials who are accountable for protecting public health. I mean, they need to be given a great deal of deference, and yet that deference isn't unlimited. And so as the court looked at the facts of this particular case, as Melissa has pointed out, and the other panelists, I mean, it seems patently clear that there was another dynamic going on here that wasn't strictly neutral. So, I think it's worth at this point just taking a couple of steps back and looking at this from a distance and saying, what happened here during the pandemic was a stress test for our legal system and its ability to protect religious freedom in difficult circumstances. And I think overall, I think we can be optimistic and heartened that that stress test showed that we did pretty well. I mean, there were many instances like this case of government overreach, and we can name many from many different states. But by and large, as these were processed through the courts, a common sense balance was found. And so, to me, this is a positive outcome as we look at this case in the context of the many other cases that came up through the system during COVID.
This is one of those things where it's really confusing for me in that this does not seem to be a one-size-fits-all. Supreme Court says, listen, local public health officials have got to make calls, but when you're in an area, for example, you're in the tri-state area of New York, where you've got New York, Connecticut, New Jersey, and you could be literally 1 or 2 miles away where there's different rules and regulations that you now put yourself in a position where you literally cross the street and you don't know if you're violating the law or not. I mean, Jennifer, how do we find this? Does this need to be something that's federally, dealt with in some way? Or are we just going to keep seeing not just a hodgepodge of states, counties, cities, towns? I mean, how do you know what you can do?
I do want to say that, it's not a one size fits all, right? What might work in a highly densely populated area like New York City might not work where I'm living right now, that a town that has 2 stoplights. They're just 2 different areas. But that being said, I think that here the issue was that we're talking about a house of worship versus a restaurant. And it's that inconsistency that I really find problematic. Of course, yes, we have to trust local public health officials to make decisions that are best for their areas, knowing their demographics, knowing the population density of their areas. And so it might not be a one size fits all, but whatever it is, there should at least be some actual analysis, some actual rationale that isn't just arbitrary. And in this case, we have the benefit of knowing what Governor Cuomo said as far as this being kind of, based on public opinion versus actual facts and data. But there are many instances where we don't have that same information. We don't get those quotes. We don't get to get that telephone conversation that talks about the arbitrariness of these decisions.
Yeah, I mean, just to piggyback on that, I think we also need to, not in this specific instance, but in general, we need to sort of cut the government slack in a way. I mean, it was making up solutions on the fly. And the same with the courts. They were trying to deal with all these questions that they hadn't had to deal with before, because what was happening was novel in our lifetime. And so, again, I come back to this point, there was this give and take. We see with hindsight all the things that should have been done differently, but overall, there was more of a positive than a negative outcome.
Yeah, I think we should absolutely be encouraged by the end result that we saw our legal system bring out. And Bettina's right. We should absolutely extend some grace to the government, to public health officials as they were trying to figure it out. We're talking about motivations here, and I think that that's the issue that we're seeing. The inappropriateness. It's not that the public health community or the governor of New York overstepped it was the motivations to do so, and that was again the public opinion rather than the public health data. So I think the bottom line is here, the First Amendment makes sure or protects the privileging of secular activities over religious exercise. We saw that as an end result with the court decisions, and I think that that's encouraging moving forward as similar situations may occur. And we see these stresses and these tensions. But again, as Jennifer said, there is not likely a one-size-fits-all for communities. But again, I think the motivations, where we're coming from, are we motivated by public health, or are we motivated by what's being spouted or said about, without any sort of facts about a particular community? I think that makes a big difference.
Well, I'm gonna have to let that be the last word, but I think you're right on spot there where we look at it, Melissa, that finding that balance is where we want to go. Don't go too far, or it could end up hurting us in the long run. And I'm glad we could actually trust the people as to where we kind of came out with this time around. Bettina, tell me something I don't know.
So we've been talking about COVID and religious freedom here in the US, but other religious minorities overseas had it far worse. Pew Research says that 37 countries of the world were blaming religious minorities for the infection, the COVID infection, and this was sparking violence against these groups. So we may have had difficult times here. They had it worse there.
Melissa, tell me something I don't know.
Sure. Well, today we talked about religious services and the importance of religious services. And why they're valuable to people. Well, according to a 2018 Pew Research study, among the key reasons that people participate in religious services are to become closer to God, to provide a moral foundation for their children, to become better people, and for comfort in times of trouble and sorrow. And I would say that all of those reasons are beneficial to society.
Wow, Carmela, tell me something I don't know.
Did you know about the We the People Bible, Orlin? I think this is interesting. Today we've been talking about the religious interest that may be behind some of the laws and the legislation, or they are behind the laws and legislation in Arizona. I think this is interesting. This Bible, We the People Bible, includes a comment from Donald Trump Jr., the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and the Pledge of Allegiance. And this is just what they're saying. They're touting at $79 a pop, a way to make sure that America stays true to its values. And this is what I'm saying is underlying a lot of what's going on today.
Wow, Jennifer, tell me something I don't know.
Sure. Unfortunately, research is showing that restrictions on religion aren't just impacting people who are religious. There's increasingly harassment against religiously unaffiliated people in a growing number of countries. So we should be aware of that.
Wow. Well, ladies, thank you so much for being with us today. This was some great information and great topics, and looking forward to doing it again soon. Thanks again for being here with us. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith and politics. See you next time.